Hello, everybody. Thank you for having me. So the story that I'm going to tell you today it touches on some of the things that Amina mentioned in her opening address about justice, equality, how we got here, the rich exploiting the poor, and even when the poor have nothing, still being bad mind enough to try and stop them in their tracks. So the story I heard from a fellow storyteller called Toop, Godfrey Duncan Toop, who's originally from Guyana, based here in the UK now, who would be a great participant in this, just so you know, if you can find him, if you can pin him down.
You
And
try.
I never ever heard where the story came from. I'm assuming it comes from Africa because of the way he told it. I don't know what it's called, but I think you'll like it. And if you want to hear my story, when I say story, story, you say story come. Okay? We're going to repeat that 3 times. And you can unmute yourself to do it, or you don't have to unmute yourself to do it. It's fine. So long as I see your mouth saying story come, it's fine. Okay? You ready? That's right, Mr. Russell. Okay, you ready? Story, story, story come.
Story
Story
come.
Story
come.
come.
Story, story.
Story
Story
come.
come.
One more time. Story, story.
Story
Story come.
Once upon a time, there was a woman. She had once been a wife, but now she was a widow. She was a widow who had 5 children. And she lived in the hottest part of town. She lived in a shanty town. And the problem for her was she didn't make enough to feed the children. Every evening, she would come home from work, cleaning the houses of rich people. And she could never quite make ends meet because even though it was a shanty town, she still had to pay the rent. So sometimes when all the other people were in their shanties, they could hear the furious frying of what they thought was chicken, but actually she was dropping cold water into hot oil to take shame out of her eye. When she could make enough money to feed herself and the children, she was so overjoyed, and they were so overjoyed that even though they all ate from one calabash bowl, and when they finished eating, they would lick their fingers, wash their hands, and then they would all sing together. Yeah, 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 yeah. And everyone else in the shanty appreciated the sound. But there was one person who'd build their house up on the top of the hill to stay away from the peasants down in the shanty town. And this man, even though he had everything, the beautiful wife, the intelligent children, the money, 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 the riches, 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 the finest of clothes, the most beautifully designed and decorated house, there was no peace in his heart. And sometimes, just to get away from his demanding family, he would go and stand on his balcony and he would look down over the pitiful poor who he had contempt for. And he would hear that singing. He would hear, yeah, 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 and it grieved his heart to think that someone, one of the pitiful poor who lived down in that shanty town, should be happier than he was. Every evening, whether it was food in her belly or not, the woman would encourage her children to sing because they were alive, to sing, to have gratitude for the breath that coursed through their bodies. And every evening, he would sit at his table with his family, listening to demands in this ear, demands in that ear, chastising from his wife, all manner of pressure coming down on his head. He would go down on his balcony and hear that woman singing. And one night, there was something about her joy that filled him with so much envy, so much jealousy, so much hatred that he decided to put an end to this woman singing once and for all. The next day, he left his house. He deigned to leave his house on the hill and come down. It was early in the morning, and he stood and he waited. He waited until he heard that woman kissing her children and saying goodbye and saying to them, stay in the house, don't get yourselves into trouble. I'm going to clean this person's house, then I'm going to go and clean that person's house. You know I'm going to be working for you, and I'll bring you some food this evening. She embraced her children and left. And he, the man who lived on the top of the hill, followed her. He followed and watched where she went. She went into the house, he waited. She came out of the house, he went into the house and spoke to the owner of the house, told the owner of the house, that woman who cleans your house, you know she's a no good. You know she's a thief. You know that word is spreading around that she's been taking things from people's houses. Be on the safe side, my brother. Keep her away. He followed her to the next place. He watched her come out, in he went. Same story, again and again and again, to every place where she worked, which meant that the next day, when she tried to go to her first job, the door was closed in her face. The second job, it was the same. The third job, it was the same. The fourth job, it was the same. She couldn't understand it. She was a trustworthy woman. She'd never let anyone down. And how was she going to feed her children if there was no money? That evening, she went home and it was the cold water and the hot oil. And they tried to sing with enthusiasm, yeah, yeah, but it was kind of lackluster. And he stood on the top of his balcony looking down, and he could hear the lackluster tone in their singing, and it filled his heart with joy. The next day, there was no singing at all. And he said, good. She's got no right to be happy anyway. She's got nothing. Why should she be happy? On the third day, the woman said to her children, listen, it's desperate times. I'm going to leave you in the house. I'm going to go down to the pier and I'm going to work with the fishermen. They'll catch the fish. I'll gut the fish. If I work with enough of them, I should have enough money. I'll get some food. I may not be home in time to cook, so I'll get some street food. You understand? I'm doing it because I love you. I don't want to leave you long, but I have to go. She embraced her children and she left. She went down. And there were the fishermen pulling in their nets. And she begged each and every one of them, can I gut your fish, please? Let me scale your fish. I don't want much money. It's just that I have to feed my children. She went from one fisherman to the next, to the next, to the next, until she spent the whole day gutting and cleaning fish. She was covered in fish scales. She was covered in fish guts. She stank of fish, but she had the money to feed her children. She ran quickly to the market. She bought what she could. She put them in her calabash bowl, which she always had with her. She put the calabash bowl on her head and she set off. And she didn't want to be late for the children, so she was running faster than she should have done. And because she was running faster than she should have done, she wasn't paying attention of where she was going. And because she wasn't paying attention of where she was going, she didn't see the root from the tree sticking out. Her foot got caught. She slipped. It cracked on the ground. The food spilt everywhere. The ants didn't take long. It was spoiled. If I could tell you the sound of exasperation that poured from her mouth on the losing of that food, but you can imagine it because we've all had that feeling of exasperation. She picked up the calabash bowl. It only had a tiny crack in it. It would be all right. What would she do now? Should she go home and tell the children there was no food? Or should she go back? There must be one fisherman who would be going out to sea. So she took the calabash bowl and she ran back and she saw one of the fishermen jumping into his boat. And she said, please, brother, take me with you, please. He said, but you worked all day. What do you mean? Go home and feed your children. She said, I can't. The food's spoiled. Please take me with you. As soon as you catch them, I'll gut them. I'll scale them. By the time we come back, it'll be morning. At least I can give them breakfast. Please, brother, take me with you. All right, he said, jump in. She jumped into the boat. She put a calabash bowl on her head to keep her head nice and cool. And together they clean scaled fish. And then the wind that had been a nice cooling breeze began to blow harder and harder and harder. And it began to rock the boat from side to side. She had to hold on for dear life, but the wind was strong, just like in Auntie Alma's story. Who were they to try and fight the wind? The wind tossed them this way, tossed them that way. And the next thing, she was ejected from the boat. She held on tight to the calabash bowl and she then used it as a buoyancy aid as she floated on the surface of the sea. Who knows what happened to the fisherman? But here was this mother now, floating, and calling out, but there was just water all around her and she didn't know what to do. She fell asleep, holding onto her calabash bowl. And the next thing, she found herself bumping against the shores of a small island. Thank goodness, she said. She clambered up onto the island. She looked around. She didn't recognize anything. She didn't know where clean water was. She didn't know what to do. And suddenly she heard voices. You, what are you doing here? And these two big burly men who had six packs, strong arms and pecs. They came walking towards her. They said, what are you doing here? No one's allowed here unless they see the king and ask permission. And they lifted her up by her arms and they took her to the king. The king was sitting there sweating. There were people fanning him. She knew to put the calabash bowl on her head to keep herself nice and cool. And when she was thrown down on the ground before the king said, what are you doing here? Give me one reason why I shouldn't kill you. You're a trespasser. You're an intruder. And she said, before you kill me, Majesty, she said, I wonder how it is that you haven't made use of all of these wonderful resources around you. He said, what do you mean? Get to the point. I'm hot. She said, well, this thing I have on my head, you have them growing everywhere. I'm surprised you don't know how to use them. Look. And she put the calabash bowl on the king's head. And the king sat there with the calabash bowl on his head. And the heat from the sun wasn't baking him anymore. My goodness me, he said. Who would have thought such a simple thing? They grow everywhere. This is wonderful, he said. Stop fanning, he said. This is good. He said, listen to all his servants, chop them down. And you, lady, will you show us how to prepare them? And she did. They chopped down the gourds. She showed them how to prepare them, how to cut them in half, how to scoop out the insides, how to leave them to dry in the sun, and how they become not only protectors from the sunlight, but vessels for eating food, for carrying water. And the people, they crowded around her in wonder. Ooh, they said, ooh, ah. And the king was so impressed. He said, my friend, you have done us a great service. And so I would like to do you a great service. He clapped his hands and he told one of the servants to go to the treasury. The servant came back with arms full of gold and silver and precious jewels. And they were thrown into a box. And the king said, you have resourced us, and so I resource you. Thank you. He said, do you know how to get back to your people? And she said, I don't know. And he said, don't worry. One of my best navigators will do the job. Someone was sent for. The boat was filled with the jewels. She was helped inside, and the navigator took her off in the boat. That night, the rich man stood on his balcony, expecting to hear peace, perfect peace. But what did he hear? Yeah, 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 yeah. He said, I cannot believe it. This confounded woman, she's singing, making noise with her family, and the tone of their singing sounds much brighter than usual. And curiosity got the better of him. He couldn't help it. He had to know why. And so he left his house up there in the hills and went down to the shanty town to where the pitiful poor people lived. And he followed the sound of the singing until he got to her house. And he rapped on the corrugated iron door. She pushed open the door and she said, can I help you? And he said, dear lady, I'm one of your neighbors. I live up there on the top of the hill. And I've been fascinated by the fact that you and your family are able to sing such sweet songs of joy when you have nothing. What is the secret? And she said, well, we used to have nothing, but now we have everything. Come inside, I'll show you. She invited the rich man into her house. The rich man saw that they each had their own calabash bowl, and each calabash bowl was gilded with gold. He saw the piles of gold, silver, and jewels in the corner. He saw that the woman and her family were wearing fine clothes. And he said, oh, your fortunes have changed, he said. Tell me all about it. How is this possible? You had nothing. You're one of the pitiful, if you don't mind me saying, people who live here in this shanty town. How did you do it? And she said, you won't believe what happened to me. And she told him how she lost her job and how she had to work for the fishermen and how she'd lost the food that she'd got for her children and how she'd gone out with one of the fishermen and how there'd been a terrible disaster at sea and how she'd come to an island and there she'd resourced the king, and the king in return had resourced her. And the rich man was listening to all of this and nodding and smiling, but all the time he was thinking, what could she have given a king to make him give her all of this? I have everything. If she can get this for what she has, which is very little, then imagine what I could get. And as he went back up the hill, he was thinking, what can I give a king? What can I give a king? Something that she gave him, something better than she gave him. I know. The language of all people. Food. The best food. A king has everything, but to taste the food of our people, That will bring him joy. So he went to all the cooks and he asked them to cook some of this and some of that. And I want you to imagine for yourselves what they cooked. The most delicious foods, and great big platters of the delicious foods were brought to boats. And a navigator stood upon the boat and he took the route that the woman described to the rich man. And soon their boats were bumping against the island. And he and all of the cooks and all of the food were brought up onto the island. They waited because they knew that the guards would come, and come they did. The guards came, "What are you doing here? No one is allowed here. On pain of death, you have to come and see the king." And they were dragged, the food was dragged, and the king was sitting there with all his people with their calabash bowls on their head. The king said, "Stranger, you are welcome." And the rich man told how he had come to give thanks to the king for being so kind to one of his countrywomen, how his countrywoman had come and given a boon of some kind, and how he had resourced her in return, and how he had brought all this food to say thank you, and wondered if the king would resource him. The king said, "But of course, but first let us eat together." And they all washed their hands, their face and their feet, and they all ate from calabash bowls. And, "Oh, this food is delicious. Have you tried? Have you tried? It's delicious." They ate. And when the food was finished, they all made the sound of appreciation. And after they'd made the sound of appreciation, the king said, "My friend, you have treated us well. And I see that you are not as well resourced as your fellow countrywoman. Therefore, I would like to give you something that will bring you peace, comfort, and joy." He clapped his hands, and the servants, they went and they came back with a huge chest. And when the rich man saw the huge chest, he began to rub his eyes and prepare himself for all the gold and all the silver and all the jewels. And when the chest was thrown open, it was full of calabash bowls. "Here," said the king, "take this with you as a sign of my respect. Take this and give it to your people. Thank you very much for the food. You're free to go." What could he say? He was only a rich man. He wasn't a king. He couldn't argue with him. He had to jump back on his boat with the cooks, whom he had to pay, and make his way back to his own people, back to his own country, back up the hill to his own house, which overlooked the poor and pitiful people. And as he stood there, all he could hear was, "Hee-yay, hee-yay-ya, hee-yay, hee-yay-ya, hee-yay, hee-yay-ya, hee-yay,